I'm Jim. It was Halloween, but I wasn't at a costume party, though 10 people in the next room were dressed as cops. I didn't bring a jacket because it was 80 degrees outside in the warm Fort Lauderdale sun. I sat in the very cold police interrogation room, shivering for almost an hour before the two detectives walked in. I didn't know which one was the good cop. I did know that one was the tall, fat cop and the other was short and skinny. If this was a Law and Order episode, they would have offered me coffee so they could obtain the DNA from my used coffee cup, but these two weren't that smart. Where were you yesterday evening between 5 and 6 p.m.? I took out my iPhone and began recording the interrogation. They insisted that I put away the phone, but I reminded them that the Supreme Court said that every citizen had the right to record any interaction with the police. They persisted until I informed them that by violating my rights, they would lose their qualified immunity. I asked if either of them owned homes which I could attach after I won judgments against them. The short, skinny one got up and violently shook my chair, throwing me to the ground. He warned me that I might fall down a flight of stairs if I didn't shut off the phone. He grabbed the iPhone and shut it off. He didn't know about the secret digital audio recorder in my pants pocket that was also making a record of his threats. Apparently, my ex-wife's current husband, a heart surgeon, was attacked, tasered, and robbed in the hospital parking garage. When he refused to surrender his wallet, the fingers on both of his hands, his operating hands, were crushed beneath the assailant's boots, ending his professional life. Then they kicked him in his testicles, ending his sex life. His days as a high and mighty surgeon who took whatever he wanted, including my wife, were now over. Naturally, I was the prime suspect because of the way he and my ex-wife had publicly humiliated me, legally stole my children, and left me destitute. But I didn't beat him. There was probably a long line of men who wanted to beat the crap out of him. I knew that I wasn't the only husband he had cucked. There were at least 3 others. I assumed the cops knew that or soon would. The skinny cop claimed that my silence was obstruction of justice and they could arrest me for that alone. So, you never heard of the Fifth Amendment? I asked. Then I affirmatively invoked my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent and said nothing further. That really pissed them off. They claimed that I was in a hospital parking lot where I brutally beat up the doctor who stole my wife from me. I remained silent. They told me that if I confessed, the DA would go easier on me. They understood my anger at the doctor who stole my wife and daughters away from me. One even claimed that he would have done the same if he were in my shoes. I remained silent. They claimed I was photographed on garage security cameras and there were witnesses who could identify me. It would be a slam-dunk case against me with 20 years in prison unless I confessed my guilt and begged for mercy. Listen, fellows, I said. I came here voluntarily after you phoned me. Since you have no proof of any involvement on my part and are just idly speculating, am I free to go or am I under arrest? I'm going to put you away for 20 years when I get evidence against you. You made at least one mistake, and when I find it, your butt will be mine, the larger, fatter one screamed at me. I got up and left. They made no attempt to stop me. The next day at work, the same 2 detectives came to question me again and also to question my coworkers. The cops were shocked to learn that I was at a retirement dinner in my Miami office dining room along with 20 witnesses. Several of my coworkers showed the detectives time-stamped videos of me giving a speech to our retiring friend. I had been over 25 miles away and with southern Florida traffic over an hour from the crime scene in Fort Lauderdale at the time of the attack. The skinny officer asked me why I didn't merely tell them that yesterday. I didn't answer. So, you paid someone else to do it. We'll subpoena your bank accounts and find out how much money you paid the assailant. Then we'll track all your phone calls until we can nail your hide to the wall. These detectives had watched almost as many episodes of Law and Order as I had. We all knew the drill. They had nothing. There were no significant cash withdrawals. There were no incriminating phone calls. The cameras in the garage had been spray-painted over an hour before the attack by a masked blonde-haired woman in a dress. They didn't yet know that. I never again heard from the police, but my ex-wife phoned me screaming about my ruining her husband's surgical career and she would make damn sure I never again saw my daughters. So, what's new? I responded. You haven't let my daughters see me in months. Good luck making those enormous mortgage payments now that your husband is permanently out of a job. You can kiss the good life and your sex life goodbye, I said and hung up. I looked at the liquor cabinet in my kitchen, still filled with thin bottles of my wife's favorite wines and liquors. It was all that my ex-wife left when she walked out on me. I'm not much of a drinker, but I do love Four Roses bourbon, so I filled up a glass with some and lighted a Don Diego cigar. It was an expensive luxury that I only allowed myself once or twice a year for special celebratory evenings like this one. I'm Barry. It was 3 days after my company's Christmas party and I was almost sober. 2 police detectives came to my office in New Hope, Pennsylvania and asked me questions about a taser attack on my ex-wife's current husband, a violinist for the Philadelphia Orchestra, in a parking garage 25 miles away 3 nights before at 9 p.m. His wallet was stolen and the fingers on his hands were crushed, ending his musical future, and a hard kick between his legs ended his sexual future. I'm not answering any questions, I said. Your ex-wife identified you as the assailant, the Hispanic cop stated. So you're under arrest. They took out a pair of handcuffs and told me to place my hands behind my back. My wife lied to you and filed a false police report. She's the one you should arrest and I'll file a complaint against you too if you don't. I refused to allow them to handcuff me. They threatened me with an additional charge of resisting arrest as they pulled out a taser. I called in my secretary and asked her where I was 3 nights before at 9 p.m. She turned to the detectives. Barry and the rest of the staff were here getting plastered at our annual Christmas party. She took out her iPhone and showed the detectives at least a dozen time-stamped photos and a video of me dancing on a tabletop with a drink in my hand. She laughed. He's not much of a dancer, but I don't think that's a crime. Though if you heard him sing that night, you might arrest him for murdering the song, Strangers in the Night. My secretary brought in a half dozen of my coworkers to confirm my alibi without her prompting them as to the where and when. Several of them also showed the detectives time-stamped videos of me dancing on the tabletop making a drunken fool of myself. It was obvious to anyone that I didn't commit the crime. But the detectives couldn't mentally switch gears and still tried to handcuff me until I explained that there were now plenty of witnesses who would support my lawsuit against them personally for false arrest. I said I would take their houses from them and throw them and their families out in the street. The detectives put away their handcuffs and instead demanded my cell phone. I assured them I would produce it as soon as they produced a search warrant. They silently left. I didn't go home for dinner. Neither did I go to my usual restaurant, McDonald's, which is all I could afford. Instead, I went to an expensive steakhouse to celebrate. I phoned my ex-wife and told her to expect a lawsuit for filing a false police report against me. She screamed at me that once again I had ruined her life. I told her that the police said her husband would never again be able to play the violin. That's a tough break. I guess he can teach music in an elementary school, though at a much reduced salary than you're both used to. The police told me about your husband's damaged testicles. How's your sex life? You're an a-hole, she screamed. I know, and you're the woman who turned me into one. I'm Jim. 3 months earlier, I traveled from my home in hot, humid Fort Lauderdale, Florida, to visit my mother and to attend my 20th high school reunion in chilly and foggy San Francisco with 20 pounds more and a lot less hair than I had at my high school graduation. I wore a new suit because I wanted to look good in case any of the girls I liked back then were single. I was early and didn't recognize the few people who were already there. All of a sudden, I was being bear-hugged by a bald-headed man I didn't recognize. Jim, he said, I'm Barry. After all those years, I still recognized that voice. Tears came to my eyes as I hugged back my high school best friend and fellow third-string benchwarmer for our high school football team. One day, the coach found some marijuana in an unassigned locker. The weed belonged to Barry and me, but he couldn't prove it. The police were called in and separated us. They claimed to me that Barry said I did it. They told Barry that I claimed that he did it. They offered each of us immunity if we would testify against the other. We trusted each other and knew that the police were lying when they claimed that we each incriminated the other. We remained silent, which really pissed them off, so they beat us up in front of the coach who didn't try to stop them. We knew not to fight back, but still we remained silent. Since they had no proof against either of us, nothing else happened. The coach, who was half our size, saw the blood coming from my nose and Barry's black eye and laughed at us. He said we got what we deserved and he hoped we learned a lesson. We both gave him the finger and told him to stick it up his butt and to start looking over his shoulder or something bad might happen to him too. We were, of course, thrown off of the team but didn't give a shit since we hadn't once played. We waited a month and flattened a tire on the coach's car, then another month and another tire. We learned that day that we could depend on one another for protection and could trust that we would always have one another's back. I used to feel that way about my ex-wife. Boy, was I wrong. Barry and I went to colleges thousands of miles apart after graduation, and this was our first meeting since graduation day. I learned that Barry now lived in a suburb of Philadelphia. He was in advertising and I was a real estate salesman in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We talked as if our last conversation was last week. We still felt that same camaraderie that we felt 20 years earlier. During the first 2 glasses of bourbon that we shared, it seemed that all was well in our lives. By the 4th glass, we started revealing ourselves truthfully to one another. I told Barry things I would never tell any other person. I had no friend or family to whom I would reveal the true pain and hell I experienced from my humiliation and divorce. 15 years ago, I was in a motorcycle accident. Arlene had first been my nurse and then later my wife. She called me an organ donor in waiting because I rode a motorcycle in a town filled with senile old people. She was right, of course. I was hit by a 95-year-old woman who was driving the wrong way down a one-way street. When I asked Arlene to marry me, she agreed on condition that I stop riding motorcycles. I did. I made a good living in real estate and life was good until a real estate downturn cut down my income significantly for over a year. That cut down on my wife's ability to buy luxuries for herself, and she started belittling me and criticizing my now reduced income. She didn't require a lover with 6 inches below the belt, but a 6-figure income was apparently an absolute necessity to turn her on. My ex-wife had been cheating on me behind my back for over 6 months, and I never suspected a thing, though I should have. Almost every time in the last few months I tried to be intimate with her, she had a headache. The few times we did have intimacy, she would ask me to hurry up and finish. She wasn't coming home late, but even though her body came home on time, her mind was somewhere else. Our daughters even complained to me that their mother was ignoring them. She was a nurse, and 2 years ago, I accompanied her to a hospital fundraising event. She wasn't dressed conservatively as would be expected of a nurse, but like a movie version of a high-end call girl. She had a great body and everyone at the event was drooling over her. She and I were seated when Dr. Dan, a very wealthy surgeon, asked her to dance without first asking me for permission. After they danced 2 slow dances in a row much too closely and with his hands on her bum, I tried to cut in, but Dr. Dan, in a very loud voice, exclaimed that my wife no longer belonged to a loser like me but to a real man like him. He and my wife laughed at my bewildered face and were joined by others who knew they were a couple for more than 6 months. They all reveled in my humiliation as 2 burly security guards came over, grabbed, and forced me outside even though I'd done nothing aggressive. This was all prearranged. I realized that my mortification got the doctor off. I made an oath that he was going to pay for this. He didn't just want to destroy my marriage. He wanted to destroy me. The public humiliation was a big mistake on his part. If it was the last thing I ever did, Dr. Dan would pay for this. If I had a gun on me, then I would have blown his head, or at least his balls, off without a care about going to prison. When I returned home, my daughters and the babysitter weren't there. There was a note explaining that my daughters had moved into the doctor's house while we were at the fundraiser. There were also divorce papers with an order restraining me from contacting my wife, our children, or her doctor lover. All of their clothes and my wife's clothes were gone, as was all the money in our bank accounts. He was 10 years older than I, and while my family had lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment, he lived in a 6,000 square foot mansion with a swimming pool and tennis court. At first, my wife forced my daughters to call him Dad, but now it was second nature to them. They loved being the daughters of a wealthy doctor and shunned me because I wasn't rich, and their mother and stepfather constantly belittled me to them. Their mother told them that I made no effort to visit them, which was a lie. Their mother lied to them and said that the doctor supported them and that I paid no child support. That too was a lie. About a third of my after-tax income went to child support. A year later, while at the supermarket, I saw a husband and wife who had witnessed my wife leaving me at the banquet, and as they stood at the frozen food counter, they laughed at me. I saw their car in the parking lot and, remembering what my friend and I did to our high school coach's car, I stuck a penknife into one of their tires. It wasn't much, but it was a start on payback time, a first payment if you will. No matter how much I paid my lawyer, my ex-wife always found a way to sabotage my relationship with my 3 daughters. The courts always sided with her because I was guilty of having a male organ. She canceled my visits with them at the last minute after I drove 50 miles to Dan's mansion for the visit, then laughed at me at the front door. I started crying in Barry's arms. I was so embarrassed, but I needed to finally open up about my pain to someone. When I was done crying, Barry put his hand on my shoulder and said ditto. I asked him what he meant. He said he had the same story except he had only 1 daughter. Barry's wife, Connie, was a violinist in a major philharmonic orchestra which toured all over the world. They met one day in a musical instrument store. Barry was buying new guitar strings and his future wife needed new strings for her violin. They bonded over their love of music with a cup of coffee. Barry didn't play guitar professionally, and in truth, he wasn't that good, but he loved playing for his own enjoyment and eventually that of their daughter. Connie traveled a great deal and Barry took care of their daughter in his wife's absence. Barry said that in hindsight, the only problem he saw on the horizon was the way his ex-wife grabbed the guitar from his hands one day. She screamed that if he sang Baby Beluga to their daughter one more time, she would break the guitar over his head. He and his daughter were very close. His daughter loved that song and demanded that he play and sing it to her every night at dinner. Connie calmed down and tried to explain that she had perfect pitch and his off-key singing and guitar playing was pure torture to her. Connie eventually left him for Harvey, another violinist in the orchestra. Barry, his parents, his wife, and daughter were at a steakhouse restaurant celebrating Barry's birthday. They had just been seated when the other man waltzed into the restaurant along with a big bodyguard and sat down uninvited at their table. Barry's wife explained that she and the other violinist were in love and she was leaving her husband. She said it loudly enough so most of the restaurant could hear her. She and her lover wanted him humiliated. She, the other man, and her daughter got up and left. When Barry tried to grab the hand of his daughter, the big bruiser grabbed Barry by the neck, choking him and pushed him back in his chair by painfully bending his wrist almost to the breaking point. Barry grabbed his steak knife and slashed the guy's wrist. Blood spurted all over the table as Barry ran out of the restaurant. It was too late. His daughter and wife were gone. The police decided that Barry acted in self-defense and the big bruiser was convicted of false imprisonment. The big guy's wrist tendon was severed and he would never have full use of his right hand. He vowed revenge on Barry when he got out of prison, but nothing came of it. Still, Barry carried a gun for a few months when the police notified Barry that the big guy was released from jail. Barry's only regret was that he slashed the bruiser's wrist and not the wrist of his wife's violinist lover, ending his career. Everyone in the orchestra knew for months that she was cheating on Barry, but none of them said a word to him. He had thought that these people were also his friends. He'd known them for many years. She left Barry, took their daughter, and all of his money. While Barry lived in a 3-story walk-up apartment, Barry's daughter, his ex-wife, and her new husband all lived in Barry's house. Barry still paid the mortgage and taxes on it, while his wife's lover lived there for free. Barry too had a hard time visiting with and maintaining a relationship with his daughter. Neither Barry nor I had cheated on our wives. We didn't know why they hated us so much, but they did. Now, of course, we hated them even more than they hated us. We shared our revenge daydreams. I leaned towards a shotgun blast between the doctor's legs, while Barry was partial to hanging his ex-wife's husband from a lamppost by his balls. We actually started laughing about these absurd fantasies but agreed that we both needed revenge to feel like men again. We talked about how much we wanted to beat the shit out of the two men who had ruined our lives and humiliated us. We also talked about our desire to avoid jail. As we looked into each other's eyes, we realized that we really had to get our revenge if we were ever to move on with our lives. It wasn't optional. If our wives had just said they wanted divorces, Barry and I would, of course, be heartbroken but wouldn't have had this primal need for revenge. It was the way they publicly humiliated us that demanded revenge. I thought for a moment and came up with a possible answer based on a movie I once saw with my oldest daughter. I told him our solution may lie in an old Alfred Hitchcock movie. Barry asked what Rear Window had to do with our plight. I shook my head no. Birds? He asked. Again, I shook my head no. 39 Steps? Spellbound? Finally, I blurted out Strangers on a Train. Barry didn't know that movie. It's about two strangers, each of whom wants to kill someone. They can't because they would each be the prime suspect, but if they each had airtight alibis when they killed each other's nemesis, they wouldn't be caught. Barry immediately understood. So if I have an airtight alibi and you beat the shit out of my wife's lover and I do the same for you, we both walk away untouched. Exactly, I answered. Without 4 glasses of bourbon each, I don't know if this idea would have sounded so appealing. Barry, let's get out of here now before people notice us speaking together. We don't want any witnesses that we still know each other. We left separately and met up at a restaurant a few blocks away. Unlike the Hitchcock movie, we didn't plan on killing anyone, just painfully ruining their lives and crushing their egos like they had crushed ours. We agreed not to hurt our ex-wives, as tempting as it seemed, because they were still the mothers of our daughters. We knew their financial ruin would be collateral damage, but we could live with that. Hell, we would revel in it. I felt better than I had felt since that night when my wife danced off with Dr. Dan. Her surgeon boyfriend paid for the costliest, nastiest divorce lawyer on earth to represent her, take away my children, and make my life hell. I exhausted my savings paying lawyers to unsuccessfully fight them until all my savings were gone and I lived from paycheck to paycheck. Barry and I drank a lot of coffee to sober up and ate too many fried onion rings as we hatched our plan. Our waitress was pretty and wore tights that hugged a great bum. We each looked at her just once and then went back to our project. The first order of business was to begin withdrawing cash from our banks in small amounts that wouldn't later attract any police interest if either of us became suspects. We would each need a few thousand untraceable dollars. Then we would buy 2 untraceable throwaway cell phones with which to communicate with each other, steel boots, and a taser for each of us. Barry visited casinos in Atlantic City to account for the $500 or more he withdrew from the bank each week. I did the same with the Seminole Casino in Hollywood, Florida. We kept the receipts for the chips we bought even though we cashed the chips in those same nights. To raise even more cash, Barry sold his guitar collection on eBay and I sold my expensive stereo and camera equipment. We agreed that for a month after each of us completed our task, we would still withdraw money and go to the casinos. Then we would join Gamblers Anonymous and stop going to casinos. Since the police would subpoena our internet search histories, we were careful to do any incriminating searches, like Amtrak train schedules, on computers at our local libraries. Upon returning to our present cities, our first order of business was to track our targets and try to find a good place and time for payback. We couldn't fly to the other city at payback time because that would leave a paper trail with our IDs needed to buy airline tickets. We would use Amtrak, which doesn't demand IDs. We would literally become strangers on a train. Within an hour of each attack, the attacker would be on a train in a private compartment, so no one would recognize us heading home with no record of having been out of town. His ex-wife's new husband was now an unemployed fiddler, and his ex-wife didn't make enough money to support her daughter. When his ex-wife and the orchestra left on a 3-month world tour, Barry regained custody of his daughter. His ex-wife divorced her second husband. She tried to crawl back to Barry, but he laughed in her face as he slammed his front door closed. Barry's final revenge was the court order allowing him to move back into his house with his daughter while his wife had nowhere to go. I too gained primary legal custody of my daughters. My ex and her husband no longer lived in a mansion but a 2-bedroom apartment in a less than desirable part of town. He had earned a fortune but spent it a little faster than he earned it and was heavily in debt. He felt that he would always be able to earn more. A strategic mistake it now seems. My daughter's stepfather was no longer the egotistical, successful doctor who lorded his superiority over everyone he met. His ego was destroyed along with his hands and his testicles. People will put up with a lot of shit from a prick who's rich. Now that he was a poor prick, he no longer received the adulation he had been addicted to. 6 months after his attack, he drank all day and commented on how pretty my daughters were becoming. The girl's mother refused to admonish her husband and may have even encouraged it. He would frequently comment on their maturing bodies, and one day he fondled my oldest daughter. My daughters were scared for their safety. When she phoned me to tell me, I fought the urge to visit the doctor and finish the job that Barry had begun. But instead, I phoned the police. Since he could no longer afford to pay for an expensive shark of an attorney when the police tried to arrest the doctor, his wife begged our daughter not to press charges. My daughter agreed on the condition that my wife relinquish custody of her and her sisters to me. I won 100% custody based on the disturbing testimony of my daughters about their stepfather's sexual assault, which was verified by Child Protective Services who supported my petition for full custody. A man seeking justice may not always find it in family court, but sometimes he does. Sometimes, though, he has to go to the streets. Barry and I never again communicated after payback time to protect ourselves. We next saw each other at our 25th high school reunion 5 years and 6 months later after the statute of limitations had run out on our crimes in both Florida and Pennsylvania. We were now also immune from any civil suits our ex-wives or their husbands might wish to bring. After the reunion, we took our daughters, Barry's new wife, and my girlfriend to Disneyland. That night, Barry and I were busy getting drunk and laughing for reasons we could not reveal to anyone else. We had gotten away with our revenge, and in 5 years no one had figured it out. We couldn't stop laughing as we each shared for the first time what we had individually done to each other's targets. I told Barry how his wife's husband cried and begged for mercy, pleading with me not to hurt his hands. He told me how my ex-wife's husband wet his pants as he tried to run away and ran headfirst into a cement pillar, knocking himself out. Our daughters bonded together and discussed the coincidence of how and when their stepfathers were injured. All of them except my oldest daughter called it karma. She just began laughing uncontrollably. The next morning, as we all took a bus to the airport, my oldest daughter whispered in my ear that she loved me and also loved the Hitchcock movie, Strangers on a Train.